Ukraine will receive additional fighter jets as well as new AAA tanks from Germany. But we'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in the SITREP about the war in Ukraine. Ukraine keeps striking the Russian oil and gas industry. The refinery in Ufa in Bashkortostan was hit. The Volgograd gas facility, the biggest gas facility in all of southern Russia, was hit, and also an oil depot inside of Rostov was also hit by the Ukrainians. According to media reports, Russia is importing more and more fuel from Belarus, showing that its shortage has to be compensated with purchasing fuel abroad. And we have the Russian mill blogger Riba, one of the most influential ones, showing his concern that the economic damages that are done by the Ukrainians can lead to political damages as well. The Russians struck the Ukrainians with a big strike in the night to the 10th of October. 2 Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missiles, 14 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, 12 Iskander-K cruise missiles, 4 Kh-59-69 air-launched cruise missiles, as well as 465 drones were used. Ukraine managed to intercept 405 drones, 1 Iskander, 1 Iskander, one Kinzhal, 1 Iskander-M, 9 Iskander-K, as well as 1 of the air-launched cruise missiles. In total, 13 missiles as well as 60 drones hit 19 targets. At 7 other places, fragments, shell debris did damage on the ground. One of the consequences of this attack was also the killing of a kid, and the tragic story there is that the father has just returned from being imprisoned by the Russians for 3 years, basically just to see one of his kids dying in a Russian air attack. The Russians also did serious damage to the Ukrainian gas facilities. The recent attacks by the Russians have taken out 60% of Ukraine's gas production. According to estimates, Ukraine will have to spend 1.9 billion euros to import gas to make sure that its citizens do not freeze to death in winter, as its own production capacity has been drastically reduced. The Ukrainians have identified an officer who, according to them, has ordered the killing of civilians in Kupiansk, thus committing a war crime, and the First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump, has helped to free 7 Ukrainian children. Ukraine right now has registered 19,546 abducted children that were abducted by Russia. Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab is estimating 35,000 to be in total, and Maria Lvova-Belova said in 2023 Russia has accepted over 700 Ukrainian children, to put this into perspective. Let's switch to the developments along the front line, and here we have the Ukrainians advancing towards Oleksivka. We have that geolocated here, and Oleksivka is here, so the Ukrainians keep pushing in this direction here and continuing to liberate territory. Recently, though, the Russians have taken this area around here, and they have entered Varchine. To which degree they've consolidated in the 2 towns is still contested, but the Russians are also advancing at the same time in this area. That's it from Sumy. We switch to Kharkiv, where we have no change in territory. On the eastern front, though, the Russians have advanced inside of Kupiansk. We have a geolocation of this here at this point. This is in the railroad yard. The Russians were recently spotted. This is on the map here at this point, indicating that the Russian advances inside of Kupiansk are continuing. The Ukrainian analyst Mashovets is reporting that in Kupiansk there are infiltration troops everywhere, as well as in the northwest of Kupiansk. The attacks are being done by groups of 1 to 6 men who infiltrate and then wait for reinforcements to continue their attack. The Russians have also advanced in Sarizove. They've reached this point here. Sarizove is along the Oskil River, here where the Russians had reached it a couple of months ago, and now the Russians have advanced somewhat further south into Sarizove. In Yampil, the Ukrainians were geolocated, assaulting Russian positions and taking prisoners. This is geolocated here at this point, indicating that the area is still not fully under control by the Ukrainians. To which degree it is now, it cannot be said. So probably considering it to be in the gray zone seems to be correct. That was it north of the Seversky Donetsk. The Russians have also advanced and or shown again themselves north of Seversk. This is an area where they've been spotted in the past. We have them again here in the mine and in the western part of Serebryanka. This is on the map here and here, both inside of the contested area and thus not really a confirmed change. Next to Vimka, though, we had the Russians recently here in the tree lines, and now we have a fresh geolocation of Ukrainian soldiers to the west of it. So the Ukrainians are back in the tree line here, at least in the southern part. As we can see on the deep state map, the Russians were recently up here. Whether the Ukrainians managed to claw that back as well is unclear. That was it from Seversk. We go to the Kostiantynivka direction, and here we have the Russians between the towns of Oleksandro Shultyne as well as Ivanopilia. Here we have them operating in this area here at the eastern part of Ivanopilia, and we have them in between Oleksandro Shultyne and Ivanopilia. So the Russians are roughly here and here, indicating that they try to cut off and cut the lines of communication further south to the Ukrainian positions that are still in this area. And we have a geolocation of this as well, whereas the Ukrainians are inside, no, it's the wrong one, whereas the Ukrainians are here close to Kleban Bik, where we can see that Ukrainians are actually still operating south of the reservoir, like the deep state map claims. All of this shows that the Ukrainians are, despite the Russian advances in these areas here, the Ukrainians still hold positions south of the reservoir. We switch to the Pokrovsk area, and here we have the Russians advancing at various points. First of all, we have the Russians inside of Pankivka. This was a mechanized attack of the Russians with roughly 30 vehicles that was operating here, which were operating here. They suffered heavy losses, but still were able to disembark infantry at Volodymyrivka. The Ukrainians claim that they were later taken out. So far, I have not seen proof of this. We'll have to see to which degree this is confirmed, especially as even the Ukrainians do not claim that they've taken out the remaining Russians with infantry on their own, but just that they bombed the positions where the Russians had taken shelter. So the Russians here are here in the south of Volodymyrivka, and we have them to the east of it, to the north of it, and to the east of it. In all of this area, the Russians were operating up to here and up to here. So this can probably, this probably has to be seen as inside of the gray zone once again. That the Ukrainians are fully in control of this is unlikely at this very moment. The Ukrainians have advanced in Novotoretsk. We have the geolocation here at this point at Novotoretsk. This is directly south of it, and this is interesting because Novotoretsk, the southern part, was considered to be under Russian control. So while the Russians seem to be advancing north of that, the Ukrainians apparently have pushed somewhat south here. So the Russians are operating here, and the Ukrainians are operating here, clearly still aiming to cut the lines of communication towards the Russians in the rough Fedorivka area, but this is a fresh geolocation showing us the Russians in the Ukrainians in this position. Another interesting one is further north, though, and here we have the Russians again outside of Kucherev Yar. We have that geolocated at this point here, where we can see they are between Soloti, Kolodyas, and Kucherev Yar at more or less this point here. We recently had the Russians north of Soloti, Kolodyas, and all of this is an indication that probably the Russians are on the move again. We recently talked about Russian reinforcements being sent here in this area, that the Russians aim to use that advance, that penetration they had into the Ukrainian lines. And with the current state of the front line, where there are no solid lines, this is quite possible that individual spottings of Russian soldiers here and here aren't actually those that were cut off close to Kucherev Yar, but that they might be reinforcements coming from the south that had advanced up to this point. Obviously, a lot of this is speculation, but this would at least be an explanation. According to the deep state map, pro-Ukrainian deep state map, the Russians have also advanced around the town of Nukhanorivka. Here, basically, the Russians have taken this area, and Nukhanorivka is, according to them, now in the contested area. This would make it likely that it's probably being lost to the Russians, at least very soon. Further south, the Russians have advanced north of the city of Mirnograd. We have a geolocation of this as well. We have them directly north here, west of the town of Krasny Liman. I think it's inside of Krasny Liman, actually. No, it's directly north of this. So this should be more or less in this position here. Meaning the Russians get closer to Mirnograd from the north, but they are also advancing from the east. We have them here in the town of Balahan, geolocated at this point. They've also entered this one. Again, this does not necessarily mean they've consolidated. We have individual soldiers infiltrating into Ukrainian positions, which are spread out. So some of them always make it through, and this does not constitute an actual movement of the front line, but it shows that the Russians are penetrating in this area. The Russians have also been seen in the town of Novopavlivka once again, so they are coming closer towards Pokrovsk from the south as well, with them now operating here. That was it from the Pokrovsk area. In the Mishova direction, we have the Ukrainians having advanced. We have a Russian mill blogger here admitting that the Ukrainians took Novo Nikolaivka and they are trying to advance towards Muravka. This is this here. So he confirms Novomykolaivka is under Ukrainian control and that the Ukrainians are advancing in this direction, likely indicating that the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians back in this area here. In the Pokrovske direction, which is here, we have the Russians inside of Oleksivka. This is here. This was an advance of several kilometers into the west. We have the geolocations of 2 Russian positions in it. It's too early to say that the Russians managed to take the town, but they've at least been spotted here. Once again, these are usually infiltrations, but as we can see, this is several kilometers from the latest confirmed Russian positions, so up to 5 kilometers where the Russians have moved towards the west. We talked about it in the past where Ukrainian soldiers were admitting that their front line there is very thin. And Mashowetz, I think it was Mashowetz who said that he considers this to be the most critical area. And this is once again confirmed with Russian advances. Further south in the Huliapole direction, the Russians have reached Poltavka and took the area to the east of it. We have them here in the eastern part of Poltavka and then in the north of it, still on the other side of the river. But as you can see, the geolocations are here and roughly here, but the pro-Ukrainian deep state map already gives this area to the Russians, and as a pro-Ukrainian side has no incentive to adjust its map in favor of the Russians, we consider this to be a fact. So we consider that Poltavka is partially already occupied by the Russians, and in the rest, the Ukrainians do not have a solid position anymore. That was it with the movements along the front line that I can confirm with the change along the front line. We have further informations about the rear areas. The Russians have been observed to move more soldiers in the Meshova direction from Pokrovsk itself. More and more troops are being sent towards the west. This means the Russians are moving their front lines more their troops more or less here. The obvious thing there is that it's likely meant to do a turning maneuver for Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, so to advance towards the north here while the pressure is being kept up here to finally force the Ukrainians to give up Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. The direct attempts to enter the towns so far have not led to successes that satisfy the Russians, whereas by advancing towards the west, they can simply cut the lines of supply, cut the lines of communication, and thus force the Ukrainians to withdraw. Especially recent successes at Uroshaine are obviously promising for the Russians, and that would likely be the reason for that redeployment. Other than that, the front line is more or less unchanged. We have the pressure on the Ukrainians in this area where the Russians have had recent advances. We see that the tide seems to be turning north of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk in the Dobropilia area as well. The Ukrainian advances have slowed down if they are happening at all, and we see that the Russian redeployments of reinforcements are helping them to consolidate their positions. Kostiantynivka, now and then the Russians are with infiltration troops in the Dacha area. The situation other than that is stable for the moment, but it probably won't be forever, especially as Rubicon is systematically striking the Ukrainian lines of communication, the Ukrainian supply in the north, and how long the Ukrainians can hold out south of the reservoir is a next question that cannot be answered, but it cannot be forever. Siversk remains under pressure. Ukrainian counterattacks have happened in the south, but overall the Russians have closed in towards Siversk. In the Liman direction, for now, the front line is stabilized. Borova, obviously, the advance in Sarisove is not advantageous for the Ukrainians, but so far the front line is mostly stable as well. Kupiansk, on the other hand, the Russians have started to advancing again, so the situation there remains under threat. The Russians are also reported to use more and more Shahid in tactical usages along the front line. While the Shahid was initially always called a loitering munition, meaning it can circle around the front line, around an area, and strike targets of opportunity, the Russians have, throughout the war, in 99% of the times, used it as a strategic weapon to strike targets far behind the front line, industry, infrastructure, power plants, also civilian targets like residential buildings. All of this has been used by the Russians, but a usage along the front line in a tactical role to strike Ukrainian positions was rarely ever observed, and now it's increasing. Now it's happening more and more. This could also be one of the reasons why in the past week or 2 weeks the hit ratio of the Russian drone attacks has increased significantly. Obviously, if they strike something fairly close behind the front line, then there was little opportunity to intercept those drones, and as the Ukrainians still report those drones as attacking drones and still report them hitting something, that could be one explanation for the increased hit ratio of the Russians as well. Interesting also what we have from other parts. We have basically changing tactics are being reported almost in a weekly matter. For Liman, in Liman, for instance, the Russians have now reduced the groups again, but try to infiltrate further. So the number of soldiers has been reduced, but instead of just advancing a few kilometers or a kilometer or two, those smaller units, sometimes even just a single soldier, try to penetrate deep into the rear. We see that the Russians experiment with what's working and continue to do so to find a way to overcome the current almost stalemate. Then we have an interesting video here. This shows the Ukrainians intercepting a Kh-69 cruise missile, and this was identified to be shot down with an advanced precision kill weapon system. Those are Hydra 70mm rockets that have received a guidance kit for a passive laser seeker. And this allows for a very cheap weapon to intercept drones. This was used, for instance, against Shahid drones when they attacked Israel, and this changed the whole dynamics, as the cheap drones had the advantage of being much cheaper than the air defense means against it, and thus it was economic disaster to shoot down the Shahid drones with regular air defense missiles. The introduction or the usage of the advanced precision kill weapon system has changed that dynamics, as now now the interception, the means for interception are as expensive as the drone or even cheaper than this. And now this is a proof that the system itself also works against cruise missiles, which is also obviously of a huge help. This was done by a Ukrainian Vampire brawler. This is a freshly delivered air defense system that the Ukrainians have received. Then we have claims that Ukrainian FP5 Flamingo parts have been spotted in Russia. This would obviously confirm that they have been used. From the parts itself, I cannot clearly identify that it was one. I mean, this could be the hull of it, but obviously, as we can see, it's not that correct, not that obvious that it was it. But we also have the Ukrainian military publication referencing Zelensky that the Ukrainians are using the FP5 together with Neptune against targets in Russia. So the FP5 is being used in its intended role according to this already. Then we go to the political sphere here. Russian politicians are speaking about the possibility of stationing missiles on Cuba as a reaction to the potential sale, or now likely sale, of Tomahawks for the Ukrainians. This is clearly a reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 and should obviously frighten the Americans to stop the sale of Tomahawks. That seems to be the clear intention of this. And in international support, we have news. Rheinmetall is going to deliver Ukraine Skyranger 35 AAA tanks on a chassis of the Leopard 1. This is the new Rheinmetall air defense system, basically a successor of the useful Gepard, which is doing a fantastic job in Ukraine. And Rheinmetall has published that the contract has a volume of several hundred million euros. So this should be a serious number of Skyranger 35. When the deliveries are going to happen is a different question, though. So probably over the coming years, it doesn't look like anything in serious amounts is going to come very soon. The United Kingdom has announced it's going to help the Ukrainians to develop and produce gliding bombs, and Belgium is now receiving its first F-35 and thus will be able to hand over the first F-16 to Ukraine in the near future. I think in 2 days or something, the first F-35s will arrive, and it's assumed that very quickly afterwards the first F-16s from Belgium will arrive, will be handed over to the Ukrainians, so Ukraine will likely have additional F-16s this year. That was it for today's sitrep. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so don't miss future videos. If you have something to add, use the comment section. And this channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.